A blind man sits in a small house in upstate New York. It's 1834. A neighbor is reading him a letter from the United States government. The letter is about a promise made 56 years earlier. A promise he kept, that he fought for, that he bled for. And now the government is telling him no. Not because he didn't serve, they don't dispute that. They're denying him because of how he became free enough to serve in the first place. He ran. He escaped the man who enslaved him to join an army fighting for liberty. And now, decades later, sitting in the dark, listening to a stranger read him his own rejection, that same act of running toward freedom is the reason he's being told he doesn't qualify for it. His name is Jehu Grant. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why that letter exists and why, in some form, it never really stopped being written. But to understand how a man ends up here, we have to go back, not to the letter, to the promise. February 1778, Rhode Island. The war isn't going well. Washington's army is starving, shrinking, and Rhode Island can't fill its own regiments no matter what recruiters try. A general named James Mitchell Varnum has an idea nobody has fully tried before. Let enslaved men enlist, and in exchange, free them. The Rhode Island Assembly votes yes. The law is specific. Any enslaved man who enlists and passes muster will be discharged from his master, absolutely free. On its face, this sounds like a moment where the revolution's ideals actually reach the people who'd been excluded from them, and for the men who took the offer, the freedom was real. So before you decide what kind of story this is, there's something you should know about how this law actually worked. The state didn't just free these men, it paid for them. Slave owners were compensated, in cash, for every man who enlisted. The freedom of these men was purchased by the government, one transaction at a time. This wasn't abolition. It was a labor shortage with a very specific solution. And it didn't last. 88 enslaved men enlisted in just 4 months. Alongside them came free black men and dozens of Narragansett men, close to 70 from a single indigenous community. Then, on June 10, 1778, before the year is even half over, the Assembly shuts the program down. Political pressure had built. Slaveholders complained. No more enslaved men would be permitted to enlist. Whatever this regiment was going to become, its most radical experiment lasted 16 weeks. The men who got through before the door closed didn't get to renegotiate. They were in, and they were about to become one of the most effective fighting units in the entire Continental Army. This is where you should let yourself feel something good, because it's earned. At the Battle of Rhode Island, in August of 1778, this regiment held its ground against repeated assaults from professional European soldiers and didn't break. There's no historical record of white soldiers objecting to fighting beside them. The resistance to this regiment never came from the men in the ranks. It came from the politicians who approved it and then got nervous about what they'd approved. The regiment fought through the rest of the war. In 1781, they were ambushed at Pines Bridge, New York. Their commander was killed, alongside 8 of his black soldiers. Later that year, they were among the troops who stormed the British lines at Yorktown, the battle that ended the war. By 1783, these men had done everything that was asked of them, everything that promise required. They had more than paid whatever debt the country believed it was owed. Now it was the country's turn. Here is where the story starts to change shape. In 1784, 13 black veterans of the regiment pooled what little they had, hired an agent, and sent him to Washington to formally request the back pay they were owed. We don't know most of their names. We don't know exactly what happened to their claim. What we do know is that a year later, Rhode Island passed a new law. It wasn't a law to help these veterans. It was a law that moved the responsibility for helping them off the state and onto the individual towns where they'd enlisted. Read plainly, this is a bureaucratic footnote. Felt from the inside, it's something else. A country deciding, quietly, without announcement, that the men who helped win its freedom were now somebody else's expense. And there was no safety net waiting to catch him either. The first national pension law for veterans in need wouldn't exist for another 35 years. A law covering every veteran, regardless of need, wouldn't come for 54. Do the math. A 20-year-old who enlisted in 1778 would be nearly 75 before the country built any mechanism to fully honor what it had promised him. Most of them wouldn't live to see it. Some did. In the early 1830s, two veterans of this regiment try to claim what they're owed. The first is Cato Green. His pension file survives, and inside it something crucial. A written statement from his former commanding officer confirming Green enlisted in 1778 and served faithfully until the war's very end. Someone with authority vouched for him. His claim goes through. The second is Jehu Grant. Grant's path was different. He'd been enslaved separately in Narragansett and escaped on his own in 1777 to serve as a wagoner and camp servant, not an enlisted soldier in the Black Regiment itself. But his story runs on the exact same current. A man who risked everything for a country that offered freedom in exchange for service. In September of 1832, at 80 years old, blind, Grant applies for his pension with a neighbor's help. A month later, he's denied. The reasoning, his work as a teamster and camp waiter didn't technically make him a soldier. He doesn't stop there. In 1834, Grant receives a second response. And this one is different. It doesn't just say his labor wasn't soldiering. It says something more specific. That his service, performed while he was still a fugitive from his enslaver, isn't covered by the law at all. Read that again. The very act that made him eligible for freedom, running toward the army instead of staying enslaved, is now being used as the legal reason to deny him the reward for that freedom. Grant writes back, with a neighbor's help, blind, 80 years old, he composes one of the most striking documents to survive from this entire era. A plea, in his own words, describing what it felt like to hear the songs of liberty all around him while still enslaved, and to believe, for just a moment, that those songs applied to him too. He never receives the pension. He dies in 1840. While Grant's appeal sits unresolved in Washington, something else is happening back in Rhode Island. Guy Watson, a black veteran of the same regiment from South Kingstown, is being publicly celebrated. 4th of July parades through the 1830s honor him as a veteran of the Revolution. Cheered, recognized, thanked in public. In the same decade, the federal government is telling Jehu Grant, in writing, that his freedom disqualifies him from what he's owed. Nobody planned this contradiction. Nobody needs to point it out for it to be true. A country can applaud a man in the street and fail him in its paperwork in the very same year, and both of those things can be completely sincere. That's not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It's something more unsettling, a system so inconsistent that whether you were honored or ignored had almost nothing to do with what you'd actually done, and everything to do with who was left standing beside you to vouch for it. This regiment fought in one of the most significant battles of the Revolution. Some of its men stormed the British lines at Yorktown, the battle that ended the war, and yet, more than 250 years later, descendants of these soldiers are still working to get their names properly remembered, still pushing for the kind of recognition Guy Watson received in his own lifetime, but that history, as a whole, never fully extended to the men who earned it. The debt was never formally closed. It just stopped being anyone's job to pay it. Jehu Grant asked one thing of his country, that it recognized what he had already done. He didn't ask for gratitude. He asked for consistency, for the same law to apply to him that applied to everyone else who wore that uniform. He never got an answer that satisfied him. In a sense, neither has anyone since. The promise made in Rhode Island in February of 1778 was never repealed. It was never officially broken. It was simply left unfinished. One denied letter, one quiet law, one generation at a time, until the men it was made to were gone, and the accounting became someone else's to inherit. It still is.